As the shutters went up on indoor concerts, this school orchestra took its music to the streets.
I think it's a good message to keep going and to teach kids to persist even when their dreams are crushed.
But this is having a crushing impact on the economy.
Is the US economy heading into a recession?
Well, it may be. We're not thinking in terms of recession, we're thinking in terms of the virus.
The president's concern with the virus, which he once compared to the flu, was not enough to calm the markets. Wall Street plunged 13%, its biggest one-day fall since 1987. And it's only set to get worse as the Commander-in-Chief laid out plans destined to grind the nation to a halt. Under the guidelines, public gatherings should be limited to 10 people, work and school should be at home, and all older Americans are urged to stay indoors.
If everyone makes this change or these critical changes and sacrifices now, we will rally together as one nation and we will defeat the virus.
Earlier in the day, New York, New Jersey and Connecticut took matters into their own hands. From tonight, all restaurants, casinos, gyms and movie theatres will close. Here in the nation's capital, most businesses will shut from tonight. America has already closed its borders to travellers from Europe, now the epicentre of the virus. But its neighbour to the north has gone a step further.
We will be denying entry to Canada to people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents.
As schools closed in Texas, families dependent on meal handouts lined up at a makeshift food market to make sure they didn't miss out. People also queued in Los Angeles, but there it's for guns. Catherine Diss, ABC News, Washington.
Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd says the government should be fighting harder to help Australia avoid a recession from the COVID-19 crisis. Mr Rudd designed the stimulus package that helped Australia avoid a recession in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. He spoke earlier to Patricia Carvelis.
The bottom line is the government is confronted, as is the nation, with a double-barrel crisis. At its heart, it's a public health policy crisis because of the essential nature of the pandemic. And as a consequence, it is also an economic and prospectively a financial crisis as well for the country. You don't get to choose what sort of crises you have to deal with in Australian public life or in international public life. This one is complex. It is difficult to reach firm analytical conclusions about its trajectory. But you know something? Most crises are always conducted through the fog of war. And under these circumstances, you've got to make the best policy judgments possible in order to maximise the interests of the Australian people.
The federal government is preparing to unveil another round of stimulus. This one is likely to be aimed at industry. What measures should they be looking at? If you were still Prime Minister, what do you think they should do?
I think, Patricia, it's really important to get your analysis of this crisis right. I think at its heart, it's a public health crisis. I've been critical about the tardy nature of some of the measures which have been taken by the government in terms of social distancing, in terms of other measures in public health, because until we have an objective handle on the containment of this crisis, then the subsequent economic and financial problems will unfold from there. So that's the cornerstone. Then separately on the economy, what I'd say is this. You see, the first thing I think we need to look at is just the quantum of economic contraction going on around the world. China is going to be in recession in the first quarter. I cannot see it returning to normality in the second quarter of 2020. Japan is in recession. South Korea is heading that way. So is Europe, and so is the United States. Under those parameters, it follows, therefore, that a recession in Australia is bearing down upon us. Therefore, on the quantum of stimulus activity necessary, my recommendation to the government will be to be much more, as it were, hard-line than what we've seen so far. 1% of GDP, the measures announced the other day, frankly, won't touch the sides. It's going to have to be much more significant than that If you're going to look at an effective global contraction of 3-4 percentage points of GDP, the multipliers are fairly clear in this, and therefore I'd be encouraging the government to be much more aggressive in its response.
And when you say 1% of GDP is not going to touch the sides, clearly the government's come to, well, I don't know if it's exactly the same conclusion, but partly because they're scaling it up already, literally within days of the first announcement. What percentage of GDP should they look at?
Well, I don't have available to me the econometric modelling which the government has in terms of the other economies impacting on Australia. But I have written just yesterday in The Guardian that this is beginning to assume the proportions of the global contraction we faced in 2008, 2009. So you're going to have something which is minimally several points of GDP, effectively spread over a range of measures, not just targeting one sector of the economy, and spread over several quarters in order to have a cascading effect. If you analyse the measures we took in 2008, 2009, that's why ultimately it was effective in avoiding recession. I would not be adopting the psychological posture, if I were the government, that mass unemployment and therefore significant and deep recession are somehow unavoidable. We didn't take that approach. You've got to get in there and fight, and you still have a bunch of fiscal policy measures and still some room for action by the Reserve Bank by way of either classical measures or by way of quantitative easing or by way of what's called repo in order to keep liquidity alive in the economy as well and flowing.
Well, let's return now to the story we were trying to bring you earlier. The British government has been criticised for not taking as extensive action as the rest of Europe to contain the spread of coronavirus. Instead of implementing strict quarantines, the UK opted to rely on herd immunity, allowing the disease to spread throughout the community while isolating at-risk cases to prevent against a second wave of infection. And our guest, it doesn't seem as though he's there. His Skype has frozen again, so we might try again a bit later on.